January 17th, 1944, North Atlantic, 53N28W. The gray water churned beneath a sky the color of wet slate. Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Steinhoff stood in the conning tower of U-641, salt spray stinging his face, binoculars pressed against his eyes until the rubber cups left imprints on his skin. The wind carried no sound but its own howling. No engine rumble, no propeller churn, nothing to betray the enemy. Yet somewhere out there, beyond the curtain of fog and February cold, a convoy moved. He knew it moved because the Befehlshaber U-boat had told him so, because the charts and the calculations and the carefully coordinated Wolf-Pack positions all said it must be there. But the ocean before him stretched empty, indifferent, and for the first time in 23 months of war, Steinhoff felt the creeping sensation that he was not the hunter, but the hunted. He lowered his binoculars. The leather case, worn smooth by 1,000 Atlantic watches, felt suddenly heavier than it should. In his breast pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft, was his wife's last letter from Hamburg, written before the firestorm, before the city became a noun that meant something different than it had before. He did not know yet that she was gone. He knew only that the convoys were slipping through, that the certainty which had once defined U-boat operations had curdled into doubt, that the ocean, which had been their ally, now felt like a betrayer, 700 miles to the west, in a cramped operations room aboard the destroyer escort USS Eugene A. Elmore. A 23-year-old radar operator named Tommy Chun watched a pale green sweep rotate across a cathode screen no larger than a dinner plate. The image flickered, pulsed, bloomed with ghost returns from wave tops and rain squalls. But there, at bearing 270, range 11,000 yards, a contact held steady through 3 consecutive sweeps. Chung toggled the intercom. His voice, flat and practiced, betrayed none of the adrenaline now singing through his veins. Bridge, combat. Surface contact, designation Sierra 4, bearing 270, range 11,000 yards, course 0-9er-0. Designate hostile. Recommend intercept. The green light of the scope washed his face in an eerie glow, and in that glow, the future of naval warfare flickered into being, not with thunder or fire, but with the quiet persistence of electrons, dancing across phosphor. The transformation had not come quickly. It had not come easily. And for the first 2 years of the Battle of the Atlantic, it had not come at all when the Wolf Packs first descended upon the Allied convoy routes in 1940. They did so with the confidence of apex predators entering an ocean of prey. The tactics were elegant in their simplicity. Gather in coordinated groups, strike at night on the surface where U-boats were fastest and hardest to detect, overwhelm the escorts with numbers, vanish into the depths before dawn. Admiral Karl Dönitz had refined these methods with Prussian precision, and the results spoke in a language every naval commander understood: tonnage sent to the bottom, crew manifests that became casualty lists, oil slicks spreading across cold water like epitaphs. In 1940, German U-boats sank over 2 million tons of eyed shipping. In 1941, that figure climbed past 4 million. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Britain imported nearly 70% of its food and raw materials by sea. Sever. That lifeline and the island would starve long before the first Wehrmacht soldier set boot on English soil. The U-boat commanders knew this. Churchill knew this. And in the desperate arithmetic of 1941 and 1942, the submarines were winning. The Allied response had been to throw everything available into the fight. More escorts, more aircraft, more convoy routes zigzagging across the North Atlantic in patterns that grew ever more complex and ever less effective. They deployed a SDIC, the Underwater Sound Detection System, the British had developed with such hope after the First World War, but a SDIC was useful only against submerged submarines, and the Wolf packs hunted on the surface at night, where the primitive sonar was blind. They stationed aircraft over the convoys when weather permitted, but the mid-Atlantic air gap remained beyond the range of land-based planes, a vast killing ground where the U-boats operated with near impunity. They trained their lookouts to scan the horizons with fanatical discipline, but human eyes, no matter how keen, cannot see in the dark, cannot pierce fog, cannot penetrate the 11,000-yard envelope where a surfaced U-boat could stalk. A convoy undetected until the moment it chose to strike. The convoys bled, the merchant sailors died, and the commanders of the escort groups, brave and experienced men who had learned their trade in the crucible of war, began to develop a certainty that bordered on fatalism. The Atlantic could not be won. It could only be endured. Into this crucible came radar. The technology itself was not new. British and American scientists had been experimenting with radio detection and ranging since the late 1930s, and by 1940, primitive air search radars had proven their worth in detecting incoming Luftwaffe raids during the Battle of Britain. But adapting radar for use at sea, particularly for detecting the low silhouette of a surfaced submarine against the clutter of ocean waves, proved enormously difficult. Early naval radars operated on meter-length wavelengths that could not resolve small targets against the sea return. The equipment was bulky, temperamental, required constant adjustment, and produced contacts so ambiguous that many captains dismissed them as electronic phantoms. When the first centimetric radar sets operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths with dramatically improved resolution began appearing on Allied escort vessels in late 1942, they arrived accompanied by skepticism as thick as North Atlantic fog. The destroyer captains and corvette commanders who formed the backbone of the escort groups had learned to trust their eyes, their instincts, the reports of trained lookouts who knew the difference between a white cap and a conning tower. They had not learned to trust a flickering green screen tended by technicians barely old enough to shave, operators who spoke in jargon about returns and ranges and bearing drift, as if these abstractions could be weighed against the hard reality of torpedoes in the water and men burning in oil-slick seas. The doubt ran deeper than mere technological conservatism. It touched something fundamental about the nature of command at sea. For centuries, naval warfare had been of visual art. Captains fought what they could see, maneuvered based on the evidence of their own senses, made decisions grounded in the tangible reality of sail and hull and horizon line. Radar asked them to trust the invisible, to commit their ships and the lives of their crews to interpretations of electronic signals they could not verify, to attack contacts they had never laid eyes upon. It asked them to believe that a 23-year-old technician staring at a glowing screen in a darkened compartment could perceive threats that the captain on his own bridge, with decades of experience and the authority of command, could not. This was not merely a change in tactics. It was a revolution in epistemology, and revolutions, even necessary ones, are resisted by those who have built their competence and identity upon the old certainties. The orders that began filtering down through the Royal Navy and the United States Navy in early 1943 reflected this institutional doubt. Radar was to be used as an auxiliary detection method, supplementing but not replacing visual lookouts. Radar contacts were to be verified by eyeball before action was taken. Captains retained discretion to disregard radar information if it contradicted their own assessment of the tactical situation. These restrictions seemed prudent, even necessary, to men who had seen too many promising technologies fail under combat conditions. But they also ensured that radar would be unable to prove its worth, relegated to a supporting role in a battle it might have dominated. The U-boats continued to slip through the patrols, continued to strike from the darkness beyond visual range, continued to send ships to the bottom while the radar operators watched the contacts bloom on their screens and waited for permission to act that rarely came. The breaking point arrived not as a single moment of clarity, but as an accumulation of small disasters and narrowly avoided catastrophes, each one adding weight to the evidence that doubt was becoming complicity in defeat. In February 1943, Convoy ONS-1 66 lost 14 merchant ships in a 5-day running battle with a wolf pack of 20 U-boats. The escorts had been equipped with the new Type 271 centimetric radar. The operators had tracked contacts throughout the engagement, had called out bearings and ranges with increasing desperation as the submarines maneuvered just beyond visual range, had listened to their captains. Order maintained visual search, even as the torpedoes found their marks. In March, Convoy HX-229 merged with SC-122 through a navigational error, creating a massive target that lost 22 ships in 3 nights of sustained attack. Again, the radar operators had seen the wolves gathering, had watched the contacts converge on the convoy from multiple bearings, had been unable to convince their commanders to act on electronic data alone. The after-action reports, written in the careful bureaucratic language of naval inquiry, noted the presence of radar contacts that had gone uninvestigated, the warnings that had gone unheeded, the pattern of missed opportunities that suggested not technological failure but human resistance to technological truth. The losses were becoming unsustainable. The merchant marine was hemorrhaging experienced crew. The shipyards could barely keep pace with replacements. And in the bleak calculus of attrition warfare, the Allies were losing. The change in doctrine came in April 1943, not through revelation, but through exhaustion and the mounting pressure of necessity. The Western Approaches Command, responsible for coordinating convoy defense in the Eastern Atlantic, issued new tactical instructions that fundamentally altered the relationship between radar and command authority. Radar contacts were now to be treated as valid targets requiring immediate investigation. Escorts were authorized to break from convoy screen to pursue radar-detected submarines without waiting for visual confirmation. Captains who failed to act on reliable radar information would be required to justify that decision in their patrol. Reports, the language was careful, the implementation gradual, but the message was clear. Trust the machines. Trust the operators. Trust the invisible evidence of electromagnetic waves bouncing off steel hulls in the darkness. The order represented a kind of institutional surrender, an admission that the old ways of knowing were no longer sufficient, that the nature of warfare had shifted into a domain where human senses alone could not reach, where survival demanded faith in technology, even when that technology violated every instinct command experience had cultivated. The U-boat commanders noticed a change before their own headquarters did. Steinhoff had been at sea for 6 weeks. When his luck turned, his boat had sunk 2 stragglers from Convoy HX-233, easy kills that had bolstered his confidence and added 2 small silhouettes to the tally painted on U-641's conning tower. It was stalking a 3rd convoy, tracked by B-Dienst radio intelligence and positioned according to the careful choreography of Wolfpack tactics. When the American destroyer appeared out of the darkness at a range of 7,000 yards, charging directly toward his position at flank speed with the bone-white wake of an attacking warship, there had been no time to dive. Barely time to crash dive. The U-boat plunged into the dark water with the shriek of alarms and the thunder of detonating depth charges rolling across them in waves of overpressure that made the hull groan and weep. When they finally surfaced 6 hours later, damaged and leaking, nursing a battery fire and 2 injured men, Steinhoff asked the question that had been turning in his mind since the attack began. How had they known? There had been no moon that night, no starlight, no visual contact possible, yet the destroyer had come straight for them as if following a beacon. In his patrol report, filed after limping back to St. Nazaire, Steinhoff noted the incident and offered no explanation because he had none. But in the officer's mess over ersatz coffee that tasted like burned acorns, he shared his suspicion with the other commanders. Something had changed. The enemy was seeing in the dark dot by summer. The suspicion had hardened into certainty, and the certainty was killing them. The statistics told a story that no amount of operational security or propaganda could obscure. In March 1943, 15 U-boats had been sunk in the Atlantic. In April, that number rose to 16. In May, it exploded to 41, nearly 1 submarine lost for every 4 days of the month, a casualty rate that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The Wolfpack tactics that had been so devastatingly effective were now suicide missions. Submarines that surfaced at night to attack convoys found themselves illuminated by searchlights and bracketed by gunfire before they could submerge. U-boats attempting to shadow convoys from beyond visual range were detected and hunted by escorts that seemed to possess supernatural awareness of their positions. The mid-Atlantic air gap, once a sanctuary, became a killing ground as long-range. Aircraft equipped with airborne radar hunted submarines transiting to and from their operational areas. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat command struggled to adapt ordering boats to remain submerged longer, to attack from greater depths, to abandon the surface tactics that had been the foundation of their success. But each adaptation was a concession to an enemy capability they did not fully understand and could not effectively counter. By June 1943, Donetsk was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes entirely, conceding defeat in the battle that Germany had come closest to winning. The transformation was total, and it had taken less than 60 days for the Allied radar operators. Men like Tommy Chung, who had spent months pleading with their commanders to trust the evidence on their screens. The vindication came wrapped in a burden of responsibility they had not fully anticipated. The green glow of the radar scope became the focal point of every patrol, the single piece of equipment upon which the safety of thousands of men and the success of entire convoys depended. The operators worked in shifts around the clock, maintaining constant watch, tweaking the sensitivity and gain controls to distinguish true contacts from sea return and weather clutter, calling out bearings with a precision that left no room for error, because error meant torpedoes in the water and ships going down. They learned to read the screen with an intimacy that bordered on communion, learned the signature of a surfaced U-boat versus a whale versus a floating barrel, learned how the contacts moved and merged and faded, learned to detect the subtle anomalies that marked a submarine running on the surface at periscope depth versus full cruising speed. They became, in effect, the eyes of the convoy, their perception extending 11,000 yards beyond the visual horizon, transforming night from an advantage for the enemy into an opportunity for the hunter. The technology was not perfect. False contacts were common. Equipment failures were routine. The operators worked in conditions of physical discomfort and mental exhaustion that would have been unthinkable in peacetime, hunched over their scopes, in compartments that stank of ozone and sweat and the peculiar burned dust smell of overheating electronics. But they worked because the screens were life, because the green sweep of the time base had become the difference between convoys that arrived and convoys that died. And in that transformation, something larger shifted, a reordering of trust and authority that would outlive the war itself. The destroyer captains and escort commanders who had resisted radar found themselves compelled by success to embrace it, and in embracing it, to surrender a portion of their autonomy to the young technicians who tended the machines. The decision to break off and investigate a contact was still the captain's to make, but it was now a decision informed and constrained by technical data that the captain himself could not directly perceive. The radar operator's report became a kind of testimony that had to be taken on faith, and that faith, once extended, created a relationship of dependence that altered the traditional hierarchy of shipboard command. The captain was still supreme in matters of seamanship and tactics, but in the critical question of where the enemy was, he had become reliant on a specialist whose expertise existed in a domain the captain did not and could not fully understand. This was the pattern that would define all subsequent military technological development, the gradual ceding of decision-making authority to those who could interpret the output of increasingly complex machines, the transformation of warfare from an art grounded in personal experience to a science mediated by instruments and data streams and technical interpretation. Radar was only the beginning. It would be followed by sonar, by radar-guided fire control, by computer-assisted targeting, by drone warfare and algorithmic intelligence, each iteration pushing the human further from direct perception of the battlefield. each demanding greater faith in the machine and those who operated it. But in 1943, in the North Atlantic, the transition was new enough to feel revolutionary, and the doubt that preceded acceptance was strong enough to cost thousands of lives before it finally broke. The symbolic weight of radar extended beyond tactics into the realm of ideology and national character, becoming another manifestation of American industrial abundance in a war increasingly defined by material rather than martial superiority. The radar sets themselves the electronics, the waveguides, the precision machining of the antenna assemblies represented, a kind of technological profligacy that the Axis powers could not match. Each Type 271 radar installation required hundreds of vacuum tubes, precision components manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, rare earth magnets, and high-voltage capacitors and rotating joints that demanded specialty metallurgy. The United States was producing these systems in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to German planners. Thousands of sets per month, distributed not just to capital ships and fleet carriers, but to destroyer escorts and subchasers and merchant vessels, a democratic distribution of technological capability that reflected both industrial capacity and a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare. The Germans had excellent radar scientists and had developed their own capable systems, but they could not produce them in quantity, could not afford to equip every vessel, could not sustain the losses when sets were destroyed in combat or lost to the elements. The radar aboard an American destroyer escort represented not just a tactical advantage, but a statement of abundance, the same abundance that manifested in the diesel fuel and the canned rations and the replacement parts and the seemingly endless stream of Liberty ships sliding down the ways of American shipyards. It was abundance deployed as a weapon, and against an enemy already struggling with fuel shortages and material scarcity and the grinding attrition of a three-front war. That abundance was decisive. The German submariners encountered this abundance in ways both abstract and visceral, and it corroded their faith in ultimate victory more effectively than any propaganda could have achieved. When Captain Lieutenant Steinhoff finally received confirmation that his wife had died in the Hamburg firestorm, the letter arrived with a berth supply run at St. Nazaire, delivered along with a consignment of torpedoes and fresh vegetables and a new radar detector that was supposed to warn the mine of the consignment of torpedoes, U-boats when they were being painted by Allied radar. The detector was a crude device, mounted in a wooden box on the bridge, connected to a simple loop antenna and a set of headphones that would squeal when illuminated by enemy radar signals. It was supposed to give them enough warning to dive before the escorts could close to attack range. It didn't work. Or rather, it worked too well, squealing constantly, as the Allied radar coverage had become so dense that a U-boat operating anywhere near the convoy route was continuously bathed in electromagnetic radiation. The operators learned to ignore it, or to remove the headphones, or to disconnect the device entirely. It became a symbol not of technological parity, but of the gap between Germany's increasingly desperate defensive measures and the Allies' overwhelming offensive capability. Steinhoff kept his wife's letter in the same breast pocket where he had carried her earlier correspondence, but he did not reread it. There was nothing to be gained from rereading it. The facts did not change. She was gone. Hamburg was gone. The certainty that Germany would win was gone. And when he took U-641 out for what would be its final patrol in July 1943, he did so with the knowledge that they were no longer hunters but targets, that the ocean which had been their ally had been turned against them by machines they could not see and tactics they could not counter. The boat was sunk on July 13th by a British Sunderland flying boat, equipped with centimetric radar and lee lights. Caught on the surface at night, unable to dive in time, the depth charges walking across the hull until something critical gave. Way in the ocean poured in, and the boat took 43 men down into the darkness with it. Steinhoff was not among the survivors. The lee light itself was another manifestation of radar's transformation of night warfare, a powerful searchlight mounted on patrol aircraft, activated at the last moment during a radar-guided approach, illuminating the submarine before it could react. The tactic turned darkness from sanctuary to trap, used the submarine's own surface-running tactics against it, denied the U-boats the protective cover of night that had been essential to their operations. German countermeasures operating submerged. Longer using snorkels to run diesel engines without fully surfacing. Deploying acoustic torpedoes to target the escorts themselves came too late and in insufficient quantities to alter the fundamental balance. By the end of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. The U-boats remained a threat, but they were no longer an existential danger. The convoys were getting through. The tonnage sunk was declining, even as the number of Allied vessels crossing the Atlantic increased, and radar, which had been doubted by those who should have embraced it earliest, had proven itself the decisive technology of the campaign. The after-action reports, compiled in the careful bureaucratic language of military retrospective, attempted to quantify the impact of radar on the convoy battles with statistics and tonnage figures and casualty lists. They noted that U-boat sinkings had tripled from an average of 13 per month in the first quarter of 1943 to 41 in May alone. They observed that merchant ship losses had declined from a peak of 476,000 tons in June 1942 to less than 200,000 tons per month by August 1943, despite an increase in the number of ships at sea. They calculated the operational efficiency improvements. That radar provided the reduction in search time, the increase in successful prosecutions of contacts, the ability to coordinate multiple escorts during a sustained hunt. But the numbers, while impressive, captured only the surface truth. The deeper transformation was psychological and institutional, a shift in how naval warfare was conceived and conducted that would ripple forward through every subsequent conflict. Radar had proven that wars could be won not just by bravery or tactical brilliance, but by technological superiority married to the institutional willingness to trust. That technology, even when it contradicted established doctrine and operational experience, the cost of doubt, in retrospect, could be measured in the convoys that had been lost in early 1943, while commanders waited for visual confirmation of contacts their radar operators had been tracking for hours. It could be measured in the merchant sailors who died in oil-slick seas because escorts had not been authorized to pursue electronic contacts with the same aggression they would have applied to visual sightings. It could be measured in the months, of additional U-boat operations, the tons of additional shipping sent to the bottom, the delays in building up material stockpiles in Britain for the eventual invasion of Europe. The skepticism had not been unreasonable. New technologies do fail. Operators do make mistakes. False confidence in untested systems can be as dangerous as excessive caution. But in the specific circumstance of the Atlantic convoy battles, that skepticism had been wrong, and the wrongness had been paid for in blood and time and strategic opportunity. The lesson, learned at terrible cost, was that technological advantage is meaningless if institutional resistance prevents its effective employment, that the willingness to adapt doctrine to capability is as critical as the capability itself, that wars are lost not just on the battlefield, but in the headquarters and planning rooms where conservatism masquerades as wisdom. For the young radar operators who had waited so long for their commanders to trust them, the vindication was bittersweet. They had been right. The machines had been right. The contacts on the screens had been real. The bearings accurate, the ranges true. But being right after the fact could not restore the ships that had been lost, could not revive the sailors who had burned or drowned or frozen while escorts maintained visual search patterns and ignored the evidence glowing on the radar scopes. Tommy Chun, who survived the war and eventually became an electrical engineer in San Francisco, kept a photograph of the USS Eugene E. Elmore on his office wall until the day he died. In the photograph, taken at Norfolk in 1944, the ship's radar antenna is visible on the mast, a rectangular array no larger than a door, innocuous and unremarkable, easy to overlook if you did not know what you were looking at. Chun would sometimes point to it when younger engineers asked about his war service, would explain how that small piece of equipment had changed the course of the Atlantic campaign, how it had transformed night from enemy to ally, darkness from cover to exposure. And sometimes in those conversations he would grow quiet and distant, thinking perhaps of the contacts he had tracked and reported in those early months before the doctrine changed, wondering if the captains who had dismissed his warnings had ever reconsidered their decisions if they had carried that weight forward the way he did. The machines had been vindicated, but the doubt had left its mark on those who had to live with the consequences. The epilogue of the radar revolution extends far beyond the specific tactical victories of 1943, threading through the entire subsequent history of technological warfare, and the relationship between human judgment and machine capability. The pattern established in the Atlantic initial skepticism, grudging acceptance, eventual dependence, would repeat itself with every major military innovation. Jet aircraft, guided missiles, nuclear weapons, satellite reconnaissance, computer-assisted targeting, autonomous drones. Each represented a challenge to established ways of thinking about warfare. Each required institutional actors to cede authority to technical systems they did not fully understand. Each transformed the nature of combat in ways that made previous expertise partially obsolete. The radar operators of 1943 were the first generation of a new kind of warrior, specialists whose contribution to battle was mediated entirely through instruments and interpretation, whose effectiveness depended not on physical courage or martial skill but on technical competence and the trust of commanders who could not directly verify their work. They were the predecessors of the drone pilots and cyber warfare specialists and signals intelligence analysts who wage modern war from climate-controlled rooms. Thousands of miles from any battlefield, their violence precise and devastating and utterly divorced from the sensory experience of combat that had defined warfare for millennia. But in 1943, aboard destroyer escorts pitching through North Atlantic seas, the revolution was still new enough to feel personal. The radar operators were still close enough to the consequences of their work, could still hear the pinging of the sonar, still feel the deck shudder under the firing of depth charges, still see the oil slicks and debris fields that marked where submarines had been destroyed, that the abstraction remained tethered to visceral reality. They were not yet the distant technicians of future wars. They were sailors who happened to operate machines, and the machines were tools that extended human perception rather than replacing it. The green glow of the radar scope illuminated not just enemy submarines, but the future of warfare itself, a future in which information would become as decisive as firepower, in which the ability to see would matter more than the strength to strike, in which wars would be won by those willing to trust the invisible evidence of technology over the tangible certainty of their own senses. The symbolic object that threads through this transformation, the recurring image that represents both the abundance of American industry and the epistemological shift radar embodied, is the cathode ray tube itself, that small glass bulb at the heart of every radar display, glowing its pale green light in darkened combat information centers across thousands of Allied vessels. The tube was a marvel of precision manufacturing, evacuated to near-perfect vacuum, coated with phosphors that would glow when struck by the electron beam, mounted in chassis that required constant cooling and careful voltage regulation. It was fragile, expensive, required specialty glass and rare earth materials, would burn out after a few hundred hours of operation and need replacement. It was in every sense an object that could only exist in an economy of abundance too complex, too resource-intensive, too maintenance-dependent to be practical in a military struggling with scarcity. Yet the Allies produced them by the millions, treating these delicate precision instruments as consumable components, shipping them across oceans in wooden crates, installing them in vessels that would be exposed to salt, spray, and shock, and the brutal environment of maritime warfare. The sheer profligacy of it, the willingness to deploy such sophisticated technology in such quantity and accept its inevitable losses, represented a kind of material confidence that the Axis powers could not match. And every time a radar operator powered up his scope and watched that green glow illuminate the time base, he was participating in a demonstration of industrial might, as decisive as any naval bombardment or strategic bombing campaign. The convoys that arrived safely at Liverpool and Glasgow and New York carried more than cargo. They carried the evidence of a system working of industrial production and technological innovation and institutional adaptation combining to solve a problem that had seemed insoluble. They carried food and fuel and munitions, yes, but also the intangible cargo of confidence that the war could be won, that the submarines could be defeated, that the Atlantic was not an insurmountable barrier, but a highway over which American abundance would flow in quantities sufficient to drown the Axis war machine. The radar that protected those convoys was a tool, but it was also a symbol of how democratic industrial powers fought wars not with fanatic determination or ideological purity or martial excellence, though those had their place, but with machines produced in quantities that made individual losses acceptable, with technologies distributed so broadly that elite capability became common standard, with a kind of pragmatic willingness to trust what worked regardless of whether it fit existing doctrine or challenged traditional hierarchies. It was an American way of war, and it was a democratic way of war. And in the Atlantic in 1943, it proved sufficient to turn the tide. The doubters had been wrong. The machines had been right. And in the space between those two facts lay a lesson about the nature of progress and the cost of clinging to certainty in the face of evidence. That wisdom is not the refusal to trust what is new, but the judgment to recognize when the new has proven itself and the courage to embrace it fully, even when it demands we abandon everything we thought we knew. The green glow still haunts the darkness, decades after the last convoy battles, after the radar operators grew old and died, after the destroyer escorts were scrapped and the U-boats became museum pieces, and the Atlantic returned to being just an ocean rather than a battlefield. It haunts every modern combat information center, every air traffic control tower, every weather station and harbor approach and missile tracking facility where humans make decisions based on electronic signals they cannot directly perceive. It is the light of a new kind of certainty, not the certainty of seeing with one's own eyes, but the certainty of trusting what the machines tell us, of extending our perception beyond the limits of flesh into the electromagnetic spectrum, of accepting that some truths can only be known through technical mediation. The radar operators of 1943 did not choose this future. They simply proved it was possible, proved it worked, proved it could save lives and win battles if only their commanders would let them. The doubt that nearly cost the Atlantic campaign now seems quite, almost incomprehensible, a relic of a time when naval warfare still belonged to the realm of human perception rather than technical instrumentation. But the doubt was real, and the cost was real, and the lesson remains. In war, as in all human endeavors, the greatest enemy is not the adversary across the battlefield, but the inertia within, the resistance to change, the comfort of familiar. Certainty, even when that certainty leads only to defeat. The convoys got through. The submarines were hunted down. The Atlantic was won. And the young men who sat in darkened compartments, watching green lights sweep across cathode screens, wrote their names into history, not with guns or torpedoes, but with trust in the invisible, faith in the technical, the courage to say, contact bearing 270, range 1,000 yards, and know that the words alone, without visual confirmation, without certainty, would be enough to turn ships toward danger and begin the hunt. They were the future arriving in the present, and the present doubted them until it couldn't anymore, until the evidence was overwhelming, and the old ways had failed too completely to defend. In the green glow of the scope was the entire arc of technological warfare compressed into a single image, the machine extending human capability, the human trusting the machine, and together, in that synthesis of flesh and electronics, the transformation of darkness from cover into exposure, of doubt into certainty, of defeat into victory, The ocean remembers nothing, but the lesson remains.